presentation with Rabbi Mark Washofsky in a few minutes, giving everybody a chance to log on. Good evening. It's just 8 o'clock. We're going to continue to wait to see if a few more people log on, and then we will get started. Larry, I see you've raised your hand. If you would like to type a question into the question category down on the bottom, I would be glad to answer it. That's okay, Larry. He said he didn't mean to raise his hand. We all play with this as we go forward. Wait one more minute and then we'll get started. Okay. Erev Tov, good evening. I'm Joan Glazer-Farber, Adult Learning Specialist for the URJ, and I am pleased that tonight we have with us Rabbi Mark Washofsky of Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, whose topic will be My Creatures Are Drowning in the Sea and You Sing for Joy. We have to go through a little bit of informational stuff to get us started. These are the helpful hints. Everybody is currently in listen mode, and I will keep an eye on the question log as a way of people to ask questions, and then I will read them so that everyone can hear them, and Mark will answer them where appropriate. If you look, you will see you have a on the right-hand side of your screen. This control panel will help you to navigate through our program. You should all be in audio mode. To have an audio, hopefully, if you are listening via your computer, you may or may not have a microphone. If you want to use the telephone, you need to dial in, and now would be the right time. And if we decide we want to try to unmute somebody, that would be the preferable way to go. If you decide to use the phone, be sure to enter both the access code and the audio pin that is shown on the panel. In addition, you see it has the question log. Please feel free to send any questions at any time to Rabbi Washofsky or to myself, and we will answer them as we go through. I've already said that. If you have a technical problem at any point during the webinar, one, you can write to me. I may or may not be able to help you, but the most essential way to do it is to go to Webinar Help, and their call number is here on the screen. I would suggest that you write down that number for future reference. Any other questions that you have come up with while I've been going through our technical information? Somebody asked how long is the webinar. We're about an hour now once we get started, or a total of an hour. So hope you will sit back and relax, and I present Rabbi Mark Washofsky. My creatures are drowning in the sea, and you sing for joy.
And you sing for joy? I mean, that's a question there. Thank
Joy?
you. Wait, joy? Yeah, there you go. Thanks, Joan, for that that technical introduction. That's very useful information. And I was most fascinated by the fact that I'm speaking to a group of Jews who are all in listen-only mode. My goodness, when was the last time in history that happened? I think we're all privileged. Anyway, let's get started, shall we, and move on to the very beginning of this presentation, which is the bracha that we recite for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Okay. Well, here we are, just at the verge of Pesach, of our Passover season. And the topic we're going to be looking at tonight is a very, very famous midrash. Most of us have heard it in one context or another, especially in relation to the Passover Seder. You know, at the Seder, we come to a point where we recite the names of the 10 plagues. We take our finger and we dip it in the cup 10 times and drop 10 drops of wine onto our plate. Or we may take the cup and pour a little wine out 10 times onto the plate. There are different customs, but both of those are the same. We lessen the amount of wine in the cup, and we explain this minhag, or this custom, as coming to symbolize the lessening of our joy and our celebration at this time when we do recount our liberation from Egypt and our being saved from Egyptian bondage. We're still sad that the Egyptians themselves had to suffer because of what happened. And it turns out that the very first mention of this theme goes back into the days of the rabbis, the authors of the Talmud and the Midrash. And this passage from Tractate Megillah is really the first mention of that. It's in the form of a midrash, or an interpretation, on the verse Exodus 14:20. And here it is on the screen. Rabbi Yochanan said, "What does the Torah imply when it reads in Exodus, 'Neither army approached the other all night long'?" Here's what he says. "The angels wanted to sing, but the Holy One, the Kodesh Baruch Hu, said to them, 'My creatures are drowning in the sea, and you sing for joy?'" Okay, so the theme goes back to the Midrash, where God hushes the angels. The Egyptians are going through the sea, and of course the sea is crashing down on them. God, realizing that this has to take place in order for the Israelites to be saved, but wishing to show compassion to what are, after all, God's own creatures, tells the angels that they are not allowed to sing in celebration and triumph at a time when the Egyptians are drowning. Now, you might wonder, how does Rabbi Yochanan learn that midrash, or that interpretation, from the words of the verse? And some sources suggest that he gets it by comparing the verse in Exodus, Lo karav ze el ze kol halayla. The two armies did not karav, move close to each other or approach each other, comparing that verse to the verse in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 3, which is at the bottom of your screen, which describes the prophet's vision of the angels in the ancient temple. The angels kara ze el ze, they called each to the other. So while the verse doesn't say anything about angels, it's talking about the two armies, the word karav and the phrase karav ze el ze must remind Rabbi Yochanan of the Isaiah verse, and he says, we're really talking about angels here. The angels want to sing, but in this case God says no. You're not allowed to sing for joy, because I believe it is more important to show compassion for the suffering of my creatures, even though they are the enemies of my people. This is actually a not too unfamiliar feature in Jewish liturgy, Jewish worship, and Jewish ritual. We know there are other times in our celebrations where the joy of the celebration is muted somewhat by some element that expresses a bit of sadness, or that tells us that we have to restrain ourselves. I think the most famous example of this is the breaking of the glass that we do under a chuppah at the wedding. A wedding is a time of great joy, but we break a glass at that moment, and while we explain that custom in a variety of ways, it usually comes to say, well, you need to pay attention to the sad things in life, or the possibility of sadness. Even at a moment of great joy, perhaps davka, especially at a moment of great joy, you need to keep your mind on this. Similarly, at the time of Sukkot, which is the most joyous of all the festivals in the Jewish calendar, at least according to rabbinic thought, the harvest is in, everybody is feeling prosperous, and they're all in Jerusalem having a great time. That's the time when we read the book of Ecclesiastes. Customarily, Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet, is read at Sukkot. And Kohelet is anything but joyful and giddy. It presents a note of cynicism, or perhaps mild depression into the mix, as a way of saying, don't rejoice too much in the works of your hands and your material possessions. They are really vanities, says Kohelet. They really don't mean anything. And you shouldn't get carried away. So we do this. We Jews do this. We like to be restrained in our joy, and so maybe that's a kind of thing that is common in our observance. But we see it here with respect to the story of, well, perhaps the greatest act of redemption that the Jewish people ever experienced in their sacred history, in their biblical history. The redemption from the Egyptians at the shores of the sea. Even at that moment, without that redemption, we would not be a people. Nonetheless, even then, we are told to show a little bit of compassion to the Egyptians. Now, one way we do it, of course, is to pour out a little wine at the Seder from the second cup of wine, which is the one over which we recite the story of the Exodus. But there's another way that we do it, and let's go on to the next slide.
Mark, before we go, just because somebody is asking something, and I know it's sort of a lead into some of the next questions, we have Judy who is asking, but doesn't the quote imply that no one is yet drowning? Are the angels anticipating God's power and anticipating the drowning of the Egyptians?
Well, Judy, I'm glad you noticed that nobody is yet drowning. Right. In Exodus 14:20, no drowning is yet going on. That comes a few verses later. One of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, why does this midrash come on this verse? Is it only because of that word karav, and the fact that it sounds like kara, or is something else going on here? It's a very good question. We will get to it, but either the angels are anticipating it, or there's a glitch somewhere. And maybe the glitch, well, we'll see what that glitch might be. But for the moment, let's run with this, because it turns out that Jewish tradition picks up on this idea that God shows compassion for the Egyptians even at the moment of our great redemption, and it requires that we express it in another way. Let's take a look at the next slide, slide number 9. You know that the Hallel Psalms, Psalms 113 through 118, are recited on festive occasions in the Jewish calendar. One of the questions that we distributed before tonight's webinar asked the question, what do these days have in common? Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, and Hanukkah. They're not all pilgrimage festivals, because Hanukkah is not a pilgrimage festival. They're not all mentioned in the Torah, because Hanukkah is not mentioned in the Torah. But they're all festivals which mark our redemption and our salvation. God fought for us and saved us. Even, remember, all of the 3 pilgrimage festivals, Pesach, Sukkot, and Shavuot, are all, we say that they are symbols of, remembrances of the exodus from Egypt, as we say in the Kiddush, Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim. So we remember our exodus and our redemption from Egyptian bondage at all the great biblical festivals. So these are very important festive moments, and in order to recognize what God did for us, we say the Hallel. We recite Psalms 113 through 118 in their entirety, that is, in the traditional prayer book. The Mishkan Tefillah, we don't have the entire text of the Hallel, although it's, we have one version of it that's almost complete. Traditionally, though, we recite the entire Hallel on these festivals with an exception, and here it is. Here's the exception spoken of in the Shulchan Aruch, which is the great code of Jewish law put together by Rabbi Yosef Karo in the 16th century. Here's what he says. On each intermediate day of Pesach, that's Chol HaMoed, and on its last 2 festival days, an abbreviated version of Hallel is recited. An abbreviated version, not the full one, an abbreviated version, as is done on Rosh Chodesh. The same thing is done on Rosh Chodesh, the new moon. We say, sometimes we call it a half Hallel, or a Hallel from which some of the verses are omitted, in this case from Psalms 115 and 116. The second half of each of those psalms is left out on those days. We say less of a Hallel on those days, and we're especially looking here at this business about the intermediate days of Pesach, that is, after the first festival day, or maybe the first 2 festival days, and that depends on whether you're in a community that celebrates 2 days of Yom Tov or not. But all the rest of the days of Pesach, including day 7, which is a Yom Tov, it's a festival, we don't say the entire Hallel. And that's interesting because the 7th day of Pesach is the day which traditionally marks the Shirat Hayam. That's when we actually passed through the sea and were saved from the Egyptians, and we sang the great song. Moses and Miriam and Israel sang the song that we read in Exodus chapter 15. There's no more joyful a day than that, but we don't say the entire Hallel on that day. And the question is why? Well, let's take a look at slide number 10, because we have an explanation. This fellow, Rabbi David Halevi, wrote a book called the Turei Zahav. It's a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. And here's what he says about this rule. We recite an abbreviated Hallel because on the 7th day of Pesach, the Egyptians drowned. The Kadosh Baruch Hu said, my creatures are drowning, and you sing for joy. Right? So he is thinking of that midrash that we read at the very beginning, that Rabbi Yochanan brings this midrash to say that the angels were silenced. God says, I will not allow you to sing while my creatures are drowning. And so apparently, according to this explanation, ever since that time, we have gotten the idea that we should lessen our expression of joy, our ritual expression of joy, just as the angels were completely silenced, we will be silenced a little bit. All right? We will not say the whole Hallel in tribute or in memory of the Egyptians who had to die in order for us to be free. And that's a really important point. It's one thing to say, oh yes, you should show compassion for the suffering of everyone, including your enemies. That's a nice idea. But to actually take that idea and let it influence your ritual practice, the prayers you say in the synagogue, that's actually a big deal in Jewish in Jewish life. That means that we really take it seriously. It's more than just something we talk about. We act on this, and we don't recite the entire Hallel according to this explanation, because we wish to remember the suffering, the drowning of the Egyptians. But it turns out that that's not the only explanation there is for this custom. It's true that
we have
Jews
another question,
yes.
Mark, as we shift.
Okay.
Is our overindulgence in joy on Purim the exception to this rule?
Well, yeah, Purim is interesting. Let's hold off for a second, because the next text, I actually cut off the next text before it talks about Purim, but Purim will be significant. So let me get back to that as we take a look at the next passage on slides. Well, at slide 11, it gives you the Hebrew. Here's slide 12, and then we'll go to slide 13. We finish this. The Talmud, which is understood to be the chief authoritative source of Jewish law. If the Talmud says it, that makes it so, kind of thing, at least, well, more or less, and that's what makes life interesting for rabbis. But in traditional Jewish practice, the Talmud is said to be the source, the authoritative source of all Jewish law, ritual, ethical, and so forth. Here's how the Talmud discusses this very rule that we read in the much later code of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch. And remember, the Shulchan Aruch has to be based on the Talmud, right? The guy who writes the code is not supposed to make these rules up. He's supposed to get them from the authoritative sources. So in this authoritative source, we have Rabbi Yochanan again, who said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzadok, on 18 days during the year, one is required to recite the Hallel. And they are the 8 days of the festival, that's Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret. And, whenever the rabbis talk about Chag, or the festival, they mean Sukkot. That's the festival par excellence. That just shows you how joyful it was. So you have to say Hallel on those 8 days. Then 8 days of Hanukkah, that makes 16, 8 and 8. The first day of Pesach, that's 17, and on Shavuot, that's 18. Now that number goes up to 21 if you observe a second day of Yom Tov, okay, because I've got to add 1 day to Pesach and 1 day to Shavuot and 1 day at the end of Shmini Atzeret, which is, Simchat Torah for traditional, for Orthodox and conservative Jews in the diaspora. Okay, but on all other days, you don't say the Hallel at all. It looks like you don't even say part of the Hallel, or a Hallel by leaving out some of the verses. And the Talmud didn't know from that at first. There was just, all it knew was that some days you say the Hallel and some days you don't say the Hallel. You apparently don't say the Hallel at all on the last days of Pesach, including the last festival day. So the Talmud wants to know why. It asks, what's the difference between Sukkot, when we say the Hallel every day, and Pesach, when we don't say it every day? And here's the Talmud's explanation. On every day of Sukkot, we offer a unique number of sacrifices. All right, go look it up in Numbers 29, maybe not right now, but that long passage in Parashat Pinchas, which describes the sacrifices offered every day and every special day in the temple. It turns out that on each of the 7 days of Sukkot, plus the 8th day, Shmini Atzeret, there was a different number of sacrifices offered. The number goes down 1 per day. And that makes each day of Sukkot special. It's got its own number of sacrifices, its own computation, as it were. So we say the Hallel every day on Sukkot, but the last days of Pesach all have the same number of sacrifices. We read in that same parasha that, days 2 through 7 of Pesach have fewer sacrifices than the first day, and that includes the last day, even though it's a festival. Okay, so it seems that the Torah is saying, those last days of Pesach are no big deal. They're nothing special. And that's how the Talmud explains why we don't say the Hallel on the last days of Pesach. It does not mention the need to show compassion to the Egyptians. That is not mentioned here at all. It has rather a very technical, formal, liturgical, legal explanation. All right, now the passage goes on. It says, okay, well, wait a minute. If you're talking about a unique number of sacrifices, then let us recite Hallel on Shabbat once a week, right? Because Shabbat does have a unique number of sacrifices, right? Certainly compared to the days before and after it. And the answer is no, Shabbat is not considered a festival or a moed. You have to be a festival in order to get Hallel. So on a regular Shabbat that doesn't coincide with a festival, you don't say Hallel. All right, well then let's recite Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. Back in the days of the Talmud, they didn't say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, at least not officially. Nowadays we do, in traditional congregations as well as in Reform worship, but then they didn't. Well, why don't we recite it on Rosh Chodesh? Because Rosh Chodesh is considered a moed, or a festival. Sometimes the Bible talks about it with that language. That would seem to indicate that we should say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. But no, says the Talmud, Rosh Chodesh may be a moed, but it is not sanctified through the prohibition of work. Unlike festival days, on Rosh Chodesh you're allowed to work, which makes it a very different kind of thing than a festival, a real festival. Okay, John, let's go on to the next slide. As the Talmud continues, well, why don't we recite Hallel on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, since each of them is a moed, a festival, and work is prohibited on both of those days. All right, so it looks like we should really recite Hallel on those days, but we don't. Why not? Well, we follow the view of Rabbi Abahu, who said, the angels asked the Holy One, the Kodesh Baruch Hu, why doesn't Israel recite Hallel on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? I mean, they're the high holidays. Why don't they exalt you with the singing of Hallel? And God replied, when the king is sitting on the throne of justice, or the throne of judgment maybe, when the books of life and death open before him, how can Israel sing for joy? In this conversation, it kind of reminds us of the one that Rabbi Yochanan has between the angels and God over the song at the time the Egyptians were drowning, or right before they were drowning. So this text knows of that idea that God and the angels are talking about singing, but it says, it only uses that theme with respect to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It doesn't use it for Pesach. It explains our not saying Hallel on Pesach in a very different way. It only has to do with those sacrifices. It's not because we're showing compassion for the Egyptians. Now, by the way, let's go back to the question about Purim. The text in the Talmud actually goes on, so well, why don't we say Hallel on Purim? And the answer there is not because Purim isn't really a festival, and not because we're allowed to work on Purim, but because we are still the servants of King Ahasuerus, or Achashverosh. We are still politically subjugated to him. Purim is a time of redemption, but not of real redemption. So we don't say Hallel on Purim at all. Now, we do go to excess in expressing joy, which could be an issue, and the suggestion was, well, maybe this compensates for the joy that we don't show at Pesach. But remember, we also don't say Hallel at Purim, even halfway, even half the Hallel. So, we even on Purim, we remember that our joy is, while maybe drunken, is quite limited in nature.
Mark, another
Yes.
question that's related to all the Hagim came in from Wendy, which is, aren't you allowed to work on Hanukkah? And I'm going to add on, so how does this all relate to the recitation of Hallel?
Right, so Hanukkah is not a festival because it's not mentioned in the Torah, and you're allowed to work on Hanukkah. And in the case of Hanukkah, the rabbis simply made a decree, that is the ancient Sanhedrin, the big rabbis, the rabbis with a capital R as opposed to all the little rabbis today. I mean, we just kind of take our name from those guys. Those rabbis made a decree. They wanted to be sure that on Hanukkah you said Hallel. Maybe that was because the Maccabean kings in those days wanted to be sure, oh, by the way, our festival, you say Hallel on our festival too. Oh, yeah, right, yes, we certainly do. So while Hanukkah seems to be a bit of an exception to the rule, that the Talmud is expressing here, it could be because it was politically expedient to say Hallel on those days. And also, yeah.
Wendy follows up on that by saying that she thought it was because Hanukkah was a delayed celebration of Sukkot, but that doesn't explain why we don't say it at all for Pesach.
Right, and it could be that Hanukkah is a delayed celebration for Sukkot. That's probably what the Maccabean kings thought when they decreed an 8-day festival. I'm not sure that's what the rabbis think. There's a big historical controversy. Did the rabbis really like those kings? The Hasmonean kings. Some of those guys, especially later in the dynasty, were not terribly friendly to the early rabbis, at least as far as we can tell, and there was not a good relationship between the two groups. And it could be that the rabbis wanted to try to minimize their role in Jewish history, especially after we lost our political independence and they were no longer kings. Who cared? It's an interesting question, but the fact is we do say Hallel on Hanukkah for whatever reason, even though we do work on that day because they didn't really turn it into a biblical style festival. Okay, so now we have two explanations really for why we don't say Hallel, or don't say the whole Hallel, the entire Hallel, on Pesach. One of them has to do with the need to show compassion to the Egyptians. But the other one in the Talmud has to do with the fact that Pesach doesn't have a unique number of sacrifices on the last days anyway, so that's why we don't say Hallel on those days. Two very different explanations, and the question is, do our sources, do the rabbis in our tradition recognize the fact that there are two explanations? And if so, what do they do with that fact? Well, so let's take a look at the next slide. Slide 14. Okay, that's Hebrew. And let's take a look at slide 15, the translation of that. The Beit Yosef is a commentary written by that very same Rabbi Yosef Karo who wrote the Shulchan Aruch. We saw him a few slides ago. He was the one that told us that we don't say Hallel, the entire Hallel, on the last days of Pesach. Here, he's going to explain it and expand upon it a bit. He says, we do not recite the entire Hallel on the last 6 days of Pesach. The Talmud, the passage we just read, explains why. And the Shibbolei Haleket, which is a 13th century Italian halachic work, in the name of Midrash Harninu, which is an ancient rabbinic midrash, explains that it is because the Egyptians drowned on that day. So yes, the rabbis are aware that there are two different explanations, and they put them side by side. And you see what Rabbi Yosef Karo is doing here. I think he's indicating, well, the real explanation seems to be the one in the Talmud, the one about the no unique number of sacrifices. But we do have this parallel explanation, the one that comes from the Midrash. And let's go on to the next slide to take a look at how this is worked out. This is the source that Rabbi Yosef Karo was just talking about. This is the Shibbolei Haleket, written by a rabbi named Tzidkiah ben Avraham HaRofeh, 13th century Italy. And he says, we read in Midrash Harninu, and by the way, before we go on, he's a medieval rabbi. He's quoting from a source, a midrash that comes from late antiquity. So we're talking about maybe, 5, 6, 8 centuries, whatever, before his time. We no longer have the text of Midrash Harninu. We only know about it through quotations of it by medieval rabbis. They had it. We don't. We find this same idea mentioned in other quotes from other midrash collections that we have. But let's take his word for it. He's got a rabbinic source that is as old as the Talmud, because the midrash comes from the same period as the Talmud does. And he says, we read in that midrash that on Pesach we recite the Hallel only on the first day. Why? Shmuel bar Abba said, do not rejoice in the downfall of your enemy. That's a quote from Proverbs chapter 24. Bin pol oivecha al tismach. Do not rejoice in the downfall of your enemy. On that day, the 7th day of Pesach, the Egyptians drowned. Okay? Now, he's not quoting the Midrash where, God is talking to the angels want to sing, God says, shush, my creatures are drowning. But you can see it's the same idea. We shouldn't rejoice in the downfall of our enemies, which is already a biblical theme. Here's where the question of Purim really should come up, because there we're rejoicing on steroids, right? I mean, with the downfall of Haman, but nonetheless, that verse in Proverbs is still there, ready to be pulled out when someone needs it. And here's where we need it to explain why we don't say the Hallel on the last days of Pesach. Okay? So, in fact, we have these two explanations. The one given by the Talmud, the technical, formal explanation that has to do with the number of sacrifices. And then we have the more, the more ethical, homiletical style explanation in the Midrash, telling us, teaching us lessons about how to live. We ought to live in such a way that we show compassion to everyone around us, even to our enemies, the ones for whom it is hardest to show compassion, even to the Egyptians, who enslaved us, and we recognize that need by cutting down on the amount of Hallel that we recite. All right, so we've got these two, dueling explanations, we might call them. The question is, at this point, well, which one of these explanations is right? Okay, and that's one of the questions I asked. How do we account for the existence of two different explanations for the same fact? Well, different people write different things at different times. It's easy for them to come up with different rationales for the same thing. But what does the tradition do with that? Does it say, only one of these explanations is correct? The other one is just, fluff, or, we don't pay any attention to it. Or maybe both of these explanations are correct. One may be more correct than the other one, but perhaps both of them are equally correct, depending on what we're talking about. Let's see what later authorities do with this problem, how they try to answer it. Let's go to the next slides, 17 and then 18. This is the Aruch HaShulchan. It's a halachic work, a compendium of Jewish law. It was put together fairly recently in our history, the turn of the 20th century, by a rabbi named Epstein from Lithuania. And he's talking about this practice of ours not to say the entire Hallel on the last day of Pesach. And he says that the Turei Zahav, remember him, the commentary to the Shulchan Aruch, he explains this rule in accordance with drash, that is the homiletical interpretation. That's the my children are drowning in the sea business. But the legally correct explanation, the ikar hata'am in Hebrew, the explanation that's the real one, is that the last 6 days of Pesach do not each have a unique number of sacrifices, unlike the days of Sukkot. Okay? So this guy, this halachic authority, says, look, I know there are two different explanations given in the sources, but the ones who cite that business about the Egyptians drowning in the sea and we have to be nice to them and not sing for joy at their suffering, that's homiletics. That's a nice kind of thing that you might say in a sermon, but it's not the real legal explanation for why we change our pattern of observance on the last days of Pesach by not saying the entire Hallel. Now let's go on even to the next slide. Okay, and the slide after that. I wanted to have the Hebrew as well as the English in case we need to refer to the Hebrew. This is a commentary called Torah Tamimah. It's also by a rabbi named Epstein. He is the son of the rabbi who wrote the immediately preceding source. And what this guy does is writes a commentary to the Torah based on all of the statements in the Talmud and the Midrash on that passage of the Torah. So it's a 5-volume commentary. It's really a very, very interesting work. Here's what he says to our verse. Remember Exodus 14, verse 20, which is the verse on which Rabbi Yochanan made that Midrash that said, my children are drowning in the sea and you sing for joy? The author of the Torah Tamimah points out that the different halachic authorities, some of them cite this Midrash, God telling the angels to be quiet, as the reason why we don't say the entire Hallel on Pesach, and he asks the question, what led these authorities to adopt this homiletical explanation, the drash? He uses his dad's word to describe this story about the Egyptians. That's, it's a nice explanation, but it's not the real one, because look, the Talmud, which remember is the authoritative source, explains that we only recite the complete Hallel on days that have a unique number of sacrifices. And, he says, this explanation, the one in the Talmud, is actually superior to that of the drash. It's a better explanation, for really, when you get right down to it, what's the difference between the full Hallel and the abbreviated Hallel? Each of them is a joyful song. It's a shirah. We are singing for joy at our redemption. We are singing for joy at a moment when the Egyptians drowned in the sea, just as Moses and the Israelites, when they got through the sea, and Miriam too with the women and their timbrels dancing, etc., and we can sing the song, but let's not do that now, sang the song for joy. They were not silenced. They were not told shush, or how about singing only half of this song? We all sing, we all say the Hallel, and at a certain point, it doesn't really matter, whether you sing the entire Hallel or you say only part of it, you're still singing for joy. So if you want the real reason why we don't say the entire Hallel, says this guy, it must be because of the technical, legal, formal argument that says that those days don't have a unique number of sacrifices. So we have these two explanations, but the authorities seem puzzled that the more homiletical, ethical one keeps getting so much play in the commentaries and in our discussion of why we practice the halakha the way we do. So I want now to turn to an even deeper issue. I want to ask the question, where does that explanation actually come from? Let's take a look at the next passage. This midrash from Exodus Rabbah, another great collection of midrashim on the Torah, sounds very much like the midrash that we read at the beginning of tonight's session. Rabbi Yochanan said, on the night that Israel passed through the sea, the angels wanted to sing before the Holy One, but he did not allow it. He said to them, my legions are in distress, and you want to sing for joy? Okay, it's pretty much the exact same midrash, except for one big difference. Here, the angels want to sing while the Israelites are passing through the sea, or about to pass through the sea, and God is concerned about God's own people. The word legions is the exact translation in the Hebrew. It's legionotai, my legions. It was such a great word in Latin, they decided to borrow it for Hebrew. My armies are in distress. They're suffering, their back is against the wall, they're about to drown, and you want to sing for joy? But once the Israelites emerged from the sea, he goes on, the angels wanted to be the first to sing to the Holy One. But the Kodesh Baruch Hu said to them, not yet, let my children sing first. And this is what is meant by Az Yashir Moshe, then, the word Az, sang Moses and the Israelites. Why then? Well, then, in front of the angels. That's how the Midrash expresses it. In this version of the Midrash, and notice the same Rabbi Yochanan is the author of this Midrash as the author of the one we had. Let's go on to the next slide, Joan, because I want to, we can put these two up parallel to each other. It's Rabbi Yochanan in both cases. In the Talmudic example on the right-hand column, God is concerned about the Egyptians. In the example in Exodus Rabbah, God is concerned about the Israelites. We're not showing compassion for our enemies, we're showing compassion for ourselves. What gives here? Did Rabbi Yochanan create two different, separate, but equal or almost equal midrashim? If you're the academic scholarly type, if you teach at a university or at one of these modern rabbinical schools like the Hebrew Union College, the way you look at something like this is to presume that what we have here is a variant reading, two variant readings of one original text. It's unlikely that the same rabbi, in this case Rabbi Yochanan, would have authored separately two midrashim that are almost identical to each other, but take out the Israelites, put in the Egyptians, or vice versa. Chances are he only said one of these things, but that in the course of time, remember these things are transmitted orally, or they're written down by scribes who may not be aware of exactly what words they're writing. They're just copying from one text to another. In the chain of transmission, texts change over time, and we have a lot of that in Jewish tradition up until the invention of printing, which tended to put the same text in everybody's hand around the world, and that kind of put the kibosh on variant texts for the most part, not entirely. So one of these two commentaries, one of these two midrashim on Exodus chapter 14, verse 20, is the real one, the correct one. Now, if you have to ask which one is the original one, I think you have to go with the one on the left-hand side. I think it's more likely that Rabbi Yochanan's midrash originally has God showing concern and compassion not for the Egyptians, but for the Israelites, for several reasons. First, first and foremost, this midrash, to say it's about the Israelites really comports with the chronology. We had a question at the very beginning of our session tonight about, but they're not drowning yet. The Egyptians aren't drowning yet. Well, that's precisely the point. I said, wait, we'll come back to that. Well, we've come back to that, and that's a very good point. The Egyptians aren't drowning at this moment. It's unlikely that God would tell the angel, shush, my creatures are drowning in the sea, when they're not yet drowning. Now, maybe we could read it, well, they're about to drown, or I'm predicting they're going to drown, but they're literally not drowning yet. On the other hand, the Israelites are in distress. The word is bitzara in tsuris, literally, at this moment, and it's much more likely that this midrash is the original one because it fits the interpretive structure of the verse Exodus 14, verse 20, better than the other one does. So how do we account for the creation of the other midrash that substitutes the Egyptians for the Israelites? Well, I have to think that it has something to do, I don't really know for sure. This is speculation on my part, but I think it has something to do with the ongoing religious imagination of the Jewish people. Our texts say what they say, but they do not interpret themselves. We are the ones who interpret what our texts say to us, and we do that on the basis of an understanding that we bring to the text even before we read them. In other words, we don't read our texts from a completely neutral, objective, unbiased position. We're Jews already. We know what the texts are trying to tell us. We know what the Torah is supposed to be about. And one of the things the Torah is supposed to be about, and we know this from various places in the Torah and in our tradition, is compassion. Rachamim alongside of din, mercy alongside of justice. There's something about the Jewish religious imagination, and doggone it, even at moments when we really ought to be celebrating because finally these people who enslaved us for 400 years, these bastards are drowning in the sea, we should be shouting hip, hip, hooray, but we're not. Our religious imagination won't quite let us get away with that. I think that is what created a separate tradition on this verse, Exodus 14, verse 20, and it substituted the Egyptians for the Israelites. Now it's God showing compassion for the Egyptians, a much more profound message, obviously. There's one thing to worry about your own people. It's quite a different and more difficult thing to show compassion for people who have nothing to do with you, in fact, for people you have every reason to despise. And not only that, but the Jewish religious imagination wouldn't leave us alone. It went from the area of Agadah, of homiletics, of stories and commentaries such as the one we're reading here, into the world of halakha, of Jewish ritual practice. And it took that explanation, the idea that we need to compassion and sympathy for the Egyptians at the moment of their suffering, and it used that as a substitute explanation, as an alternative explanation for why we don't say the Hallel, or we don't say the entire Hallel on the last days of Pesach. Even though the Talmud's explanation probably, who knows, could be the better one. After all, the Egyptians didn't drown until the seventh day, but we start saying a half a Hallel on the second day of Pesach and the third day of Pesach. You know, why don't we wait until the seventh day to lessen our joy? You know, it's probably because the sacrifices aren't unique on those days. The Talmud's probably right about that. But again, our Jewish religious imagination wouldn't let it sit there. And it wanted to use this theme of the need not to rejoice in the downfall of your enemy to explain, you know, in a spiritually deeper, ethically more significant way, the custom of not reciting the entire Hallel on the last days of Pesach, as a way of teaching us a lesson that while we rejoice in the exodus from Egypt and our salvation at the shores of the sea, and while we join Moses, Miriam, and all Israel in singing the great song, there are some other things we ought to keep in mind. If it's true that you have to break an omelet to break eggs to make an omelet, you don't break an omelet to make it. You have to break eggs to make an omelet. Well, maybe you should show a little bit of compassion on the eggs, especially when we're talking about actual human beings who, you know, may not have asked for all this when they signed up to serve Pharaoh's army. And maybe that lesson is an important lesson for all of us to take with us through the Pesach season and beyond.
Mark, we have a comment/question that sort of fits in with everything we've just been saying from Larry.
Okay.
Could Rabbi Yochanan have composed a three-point sermon, having said them both in order to make the point that we should have a sense of self-preservation and a sense of universal compassion, even for our enemies? Or is that for later interpreters?
I think that, well, you know, that is a great rabbinic resolution of this contradiction. That's precisely what, you know, if the Talmud came across a contradiction like this, he said one thing, but he said the opposite thing, the Talmud would say, well, no, actually he means both. That these are for two different occasions, or perhaps they're part of a deeper message, as you suggest, Larry. I mean, but that's the kind of thing that later interpreters do. When they see contradictory passages, they create a structure that accounts for both of the contradictory passages. They don't rule one of them out of bounds. And that's probably less likely to have been the original. But, you know, that's the situation we're in. We are now a community that has both of these sentiments in our sacred literature, and so therefore we tend to take both sides of the coin very seriously. You know, our feeling of compassion, we like to say charity begins at home, and we need to start thinking about our own people and our own needs. If we don't take care of ourselves, who's going to take care of us? But we don't forget everybody else, even people we don't like.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing nothing coming into the inbox, I want to say thank you to Mark for teaching us tonight and for leading us. If you have any other questions, you can always email myself or Mark. Wait, Wendy just sent in a comment, a question.
Okay.
Now I got to find it because it just disappeared. Is there a political benefit to the homiletic explanation?
So that perhaps, you know, could it have been created in order to curry favor with, let's say, the Roman rulers of Eretz Yisrael at the time that Rabbi Yochanan or maybe some later authorities lived? That's always possible. That is quite possible. You know, that sometimes we create a text or we censor ourselves in such a way as to, avoid the ire or the anger or the hostility of foreign rulers. And when you're not talking about Pharaoh, you're talking about me, kind of thing. On the other hand, I mean, that's possible, although on the other hand, the Jews probably could have explained, hey, look, this is in our Bible, and, the Egyptians are attacking the people, and we're only thinking of them. We're not thinking of you. I still think although it's possible that this is purely a self-defense move. See, we really care about drowning Gentiles. We're not anti-Roman or anything like that. I think the fact that the other version was created and the fact that that version had legs and that it was cited, that theme was cited in order to justify a custom in the synagogue, not to say the entire Hallel, long after we weren't dealing with the Romans anymore, and cited even into the 20th and 21st centuries as reasons for that particular custom. I think that has to do with the fact that, even a, despised and persecuted people throughout all these centuries was able to voice, feelings of sympathy and compassion, at least in principle, for other people, including people who don't like us. How much more are we able to feel those feelings of compassion for people in a time when we don't feel especially persecuted, and when it's easier to regard every person as our brother or sister.
Other comments as we go that have come in from Valerie. Couldn't my legions refer to both Israelites and Egyptians? They all belong to God.
True, okay, but he says in that text, my legions are in distress. So he's probably at that moment referring to the Jewish legion, well, not the Jewish legion, that's World War I, but he's referring to the Israelites who are really at that moment in trouble. The Egyptians don't know they're in trouble until the waves come crashing down. And so there he's talking about the Israelites in the first person, my legions, okay, my armies, the armies of God. That's the Jewish people kind of thing. Whereas in the other midrash he says ma'aseh yadai, my creatures. Yes, he does use the first person to refer to the Egyptians in the other version, but in each version he's thinking about either one of the two, either the Egyptians or the Israelites. That's what makes such a nice parallel.
Another comment from Larry. He's writing, I'm reminded that Rabbi Washofsky offered a great teaching on Proverbs 24:17 around the time of Arafat's death.
Oh, yeah.
Worth reading.
You remembered? Wow.
This conversation.
Well, what was that last part?
Worth reading in conjunction with this conversation.
Okay. Well, I remember there a lot of people, as I recall, were not terribly happy with with that statement. I mean, not that it got a tremendous amount of attention, but the rabbi of my own congregation said, well, he said this, but you know what I think, so it's not easy to do that, when your enemy dies or whatever, and there is a natural tendency to, to feel a sense of relief at least. And so this goes against the grain, but maybe that's why we need to be reminded.
Judy wrote, last week I heard a commentary that God himself prayed that his sense of compassion overruled his sense of justice, anger, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this just emphasized that compassion is the greatest attribute we can strive for over all others. Toda Rabbah.
Thank you. Yes, that's in the Talmud already. The Talmud says God wants his compassion, prays to himself. May it be my will that my compassion overrides my sense of justice. And it's a good question. What's he referring to? Are we talking about justice and compassion that God shows to the entire world, or to the Jewish people in particular? And I think depending on where we are in history and how we're feeling about the rest of the world, we can read that statement in the Talmud differently. Is God really concerned about the world as a whole, or is God much more concerned about us? Or, is it a mixture of both? But yes, compassion. If we have God praying for God to be compassionate rather than, totally just, then we say Kal v'chomer, how much the more so that we ought to pray for that in ourselves.
And Wendy wrote, it's also amazing how the rabbis are able to take some of the messages in the Bible and turn them on their heads to create a different ethic for our world than the one in the Bible without throwing out the Bible.
Well, that's why we call them sages.
Well, I think on that note, we should conclude our webinar. If you have enjoyed 1 hour of study with Mark, I encourage you to look at the program for the Summer Learning Institute, where Mark will be one of our faculty members, along with other members of HUC's faculty, as well as if you're interested in the Hadracha, which is the Para-Rabbinic program, or Interfaith Fellows Training. All of these programs will be together at Glen Cove Mansion in Glen Cove, New York, August 4th to 8th, and all the information is up on our website. And, whoops, not changing. And the next Torah Live will be April 15th. Rabbi Rich Kirshen of the SALT International Education Center of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, and I will be team teaching on a text about Israel. It's about a week before Yom HaTzmaut. It is the week before Yom HaTzmaut. It is a Thursday night instead of Thursday night and afternoon instead of a Tuesday due to scheduling and Yom HaTzmaut. So I hope you will think about joining us, and the registration will be open tomorrow for that. And I wish everyone a Zisem Pesach and an Erev Tov, a good evening, and may your days be filled with the study of Torah. Good night.